The World Bank, in its report from 2010, Climate Change and Development, they were already clearly identifying drying in South Asia as a significant factor of change in income, and could foresee a drop in national GDP, and particularly a drop in people's ability to live in the rural areas that they want. So it's not that we don't know, but how to bring this to action. What instruments are there, and what sort of can we together do to break a little bit the cycle of looking at, in a very traditional way, at many of these things. The most vocal group of countries on the issue of climate change are, of course, the small island developing states, and for good reason, because I think many of them with a very, very limited economic basis, one or two factors, but also immediately threatened by sea level rise, small population, and many of them living almost entirely in the coastal zone. So their strong voice, I think we hear them, they don't think they are heard, and yet they are probably the most practically, immediately driving force for action. But as I said, I hear constantly from them that they are not heard, that they don't really have an impact. And my very strong effort will be to make sure that, as far as we can impact the global agenda, their voice will be very strong in there. In this region, you have 61% of the world population, 29% of the world's GDP, and on the 30 years from 1980 to 2009, saw an average of 58% of global mortality and 42% of global economic damages caused by disasters. This was the ESCAP report from 2010. So what does it mean? It means that you have performed better in protecting human assets than your economic assets. But it is also a sign, of course, that your economy is growing very fast, so the value of the assets that are being destroyed is increasing faster than, as we already said, the institutional capability to building prevention, mitigation, and disaster risk reduction risk is increasing. So how to strengthen the resilience of economies? I'll tell you something about the word resilience. It's become very popular terminology. And it was there in the Yoga Framework for Action. I want to share this with you just as a word of caution. And then I got the idea that for the global platform on disaster risk reduction that is happening now in 45 days or something, we should invite the father of the resilience theory. He turned out to be a biologist who actually builds his biological theory on something very close to the survival of the fittest. And his theory of resilience, and that's what is significant for us, is resilience is bouncing back to your original state. Now that's not what we want to do, is it? We don't want to bounce back only to the original state. We want to make sure that there is an improvement of the original state in order to strengthen the capability of countries, communities, and individuals to withstand the next shock. So when we talk about resilience, I think sometimes we should consider making sure that we mean the same thing with using the terminology that has become so common. And I'm saying this particularly because the word resilience is now in enormous wide use, which is good. It seems to ring a bell. But is that all we want to achieve, is bouncing back to the original state? Or do we want to really make sure that we can use our instruments, be they developmental or others, to promote the goal of and the practice of achieving global and equitable sustainable development as the only means to protect communities and countries better against external shocks of various nature. So the message is really very simple from here, that the risk reduction and climate adaptation, they are well recognized now as necessary elements, not sufficient, but necessary elements in attaining the development goals of this region and other regions. And I think you can pick different aspects of it. A lot of it, ecosystem, improving agriculture methods, managing water resources, ensuring that cities and communities are built in safe zones. Early warning systems featured highly also here on the ADPC agenda. Instituting better building science, etc. You know, I already mentioned the fiscal and financial instruments quite extensively. So all these are, of course, linked to your sustainable development agenda. And therefore, they will contribute to reduce the risk to lives and economic assets. Is that enough? I don't think so. I think we are constantly in the search of what triggers change. As I said in the beginning, if we knew these things, why haven't we dealt with them? What obstacles are there? Are there obstacles of political nature? Are there obstacles of institutional nature? Are there obstacles of principal nature? And I would say probably no to all these. But I would say, and I hope you will take a look at this, we've just finalized the midterm review of the Yoga Framework for Action. And out of that review, and it's based on what all of you think, comes a very strong message about the institutions. About institutions and governance, how institutions are designed, who runs them, where they are situated, of course what resources they have, of course how influential they are. And the governance, the policies, how they are used. And this is equally important at the international level. If you look at the study on the United Nations, which accompanies the midterm review, you will find exactly the same issues. And I'll share an interesting observation with you about the UN, but maybe you will find that it has some reflection also at national level. The evaluator pointed out that the senior people at UN headquarters or at heads of organizations, they see disaster risk reduction as a technical issue. But people at working level, or senior working level, they clearly see that disaster risk reduction is a strategic issue. So it's like the world is upside down. And maybe this is something that we really need to take seriously. That give the benefit of the doubt to our political leaders and work harder on presenting risk reduction to them in a way that they can see this is something that in fact they would like to assume leadership for. And present it in such a way so that we make it achievable what they would like to do in reducing disaster risk, while leaving the technical issues to the technical people, so to say. For me, that was something that maybe I had seen myself, but I thought I was a bit alone in this observation, so I was quite pleased, of course, with this observation for somebody else. And it will guide the way that I'm working on this in the UN to make sure that we can do our best to help that to change, so that the UN can be also of better use to countries and other organizations internationally in this arena. The final point on this region and the development impact of disasters is that the concentration of very high intensive risk is to a very few countries in this region. There are not that many countries that have a very large and intense exposure, and you have seen that Japan, of course, is one. But you have a very large exposure of countries from extensive risk, which I mentioned. And the example that we gave in the Global Assessment Report 2009 was that between 1975 and 2008, over 78% of disaster mortality was concentrated in only 23 events. And you can imagine how many hundreds and hundreds of events you would have recorded in this region in well over 35 years. So the intensive concentration is, in both absolute and relative terms, large countries, like your largest countries, China, India, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, hardly needs to be pointed out, have the largest problems. But the biggest direct effect on the small island states is Vanuatu and some of the very tiny islands in the Pacific. They have the largest proportion of their population and their economies at risk. Now, of course, if a large country like Japan gets hit very badly, as it has, that will have an enormous impact on the region as well. Having a hard hit at Vanuatu probably hurts Vanuatu, but has a very limited impact on the wider region. So here we have the issue when I say global and equitable sustainable development. How do we handle these varieties in risk in a manner that do not leave Vanuatu aside and alone? And it's not that it doesn't appear that we develop instruments that for sure will fit the large countries and the immediate future, but are also inclusive and really give attention and focus to the problems and the exposure of LDCs and SIDS. So it's an issue of justice and equity, and you will also you are very familiar with that discussion, but what it means in technical terms and in cooperation terms, I don't think we have yet really taken a strong direction here that we can share, because there is a tendency, if we look at multilateral funding, what is happening now is that many governments, donor governments, are concentrating their funding to fewer countries, but very rarely in new countries. They tend to have fewer countries of their traditional partners. So even though the multilateral funding is not the final determinant of the future of countries, but it can be a very important motivation to trigger a development that is significant. So it's really important how we engage, of course, multilateral donors and bilateral donors equally in these discussions. So, as I have already mentioned, it's very consistent, and it's maybe not very radical, but it is significant when it comes to dealing with these issues. What are the critical issues? Again, it's the institutions, the quality, the capacity, and the continuity of institutions. I just want to quote to you one, this is not from your region, but it's a major problem in another region in the world, is that every time there is a change of government, not only the politically appointed staff changes, but all the people change. So every 2 to 3 years, there's a new learning curve, and then, of course, new elections, and then all the administrative level staff almost, but certainly all the technicians change. Now, is there a simple way of doing anything about that? I think that's national concerns fully. That you can imagine the impact of the discontinuity in some of the processes that you are very familiar with from that lack of continuity in professional staff. So governance, the huge body of knowledge. Sometimes I say that we know everything that we need to know to move forward. We have the technology, but it's not well organized.